Welcome to our second lecture on the piezoelectric effect and piezoelectricity. Um, Here we'll just continue our discussion talking about how now, just like we did with other properties, you can connect from experiment to properties and kind of get by initially experimentally a lot of the um, problems with the fact that properties are changing three directions, map things out, and then use our knowledge of tensor properties and notation to figure out the properties of a crystal. So we'll begin by first talking about the longitudinal piezoelectric effect, which is a way to kind of do that, and then we'll talk about the symmetry effects and how you can really simplify a lot of the DIJK tensors through crystal symmetry. So longitudinal piezoelectricity effect is if I wanted to experimentally map this out, you probably have noticed that, this part of the Maxwell's equations I described, where the charge on a surface and the charge through the volume is really not distinguished, right? Mathematically, they all come out in Maxwell's equations as if they're on the surface, right? Whether I have little three-dimensional dipoles through the volume or whether they actually do have charge on the surface. And experimentally, this can be vexing because, the term pyroelectricity came from actually a lot of that data, things collecting on the surface in response to dipoles through the volume. And so experimentally, this mathematical case where I can't tell the difference, I'm just measuring, some areal charge can confuse things. Here we're going to use that to our advantage because what we're going to do is say, we'll cut out a very thin specimen. Let's imagine that we have some, when I draw it like this, I'm just trying to show, some weird shaped crystal or something. And for example, we can cut a very thin slice out here, let's say, in some x1 direction, and try to measure then D111 as we apply some sort of sigma 11. So this would be a little slice, and we're trying to measure the D11 in here just by applying, stress in this direction, right? And, let's just make sure that we are consistent here. I think this would be minus x3 if I made this not being consistent here, but it doesn't matter as long as it is a right-handed coordinate system. And which this would be if this is minus x3, right? So you cut a very thin crystal, and when I create stress only along this direction, I end up with positive charge here. I get negative charge in the back, let's say. Now notice what I've done is the volume, in a sense, is small, and the side charge is small. So what I've done is by cutting a very thin slice and understanding piezoelectricity and the three volume dipole effects and surface effects, what I've done is set it up so I could pretty much measure D11 and that all of the other charge that's accumulated to be very small in comparison because I've made these huge surfaces in the direction that I care about. And again, this is because it's a piezoelectric, and I've recognized that this is a way I can map this out. Now, of course, what this means is that, I would have then another sample, and I would cut this off, and this would be x1 prime and D111 prime, right? And they're actually in different direction. And so what I need to do in order to relate one to the other is I would have this, and as we know that's okay because I know how to take what I measure in one system and convert it into the other. And so if I do that, remember that I would have, let's say, so I could transform from one experimental coordinate to the other using what we had derived before. This is a 1 L C 1 M C 1 N D L M N. So for example, for that 1 1 1 direction, as I've defined it in each case, just rotated, I can then relate one measurement to the other, to the same coordinate system. And so to give you an example, this is just one, right? I define this as this 1 1, I get that guy. And so remember what this would look like. And notice how, and these are the directional cosines. And that's how you would transform, measurements made in the different directions to the same coordinate system and map out the properties. Now, one problem with this, you can see it very quickly gets complicated with all of these terms. So the question is, can we use symmetry to, as usual, kill a lot of these terms so we don't have to deal with them? And the answer is, of course, yes. Let's start with the most simple property first, which you'll see why we're dealing with it first, which is inversion. So let's actually clear this. So let's take that same case, but generalize it. I have the dijk and ilcjm ckn dlmn. So in principle, there's 27 of these 9 sigma ij permutated with 3 pi's, right? But then I have to have these transformations of CILJM and KN. The good news is that let's take a property that we can learn something from right away, which is let's look at the restrictions imposed by inversion. So inversion, you recall, is x1 goes to minus x1, x2 goes to minus x2, and x3 goes to minus x3. So my Cij, so there's my transformation matrix. And so now let's think about what that means in terms of, when I, look at this. Well, what that means is that the only time that I need to worry about these under this inversion case is when these three are the same, right? Because remember, I only have C11, C22, and C33, which are all the same, right? So anytime the indices are equal, I will end up with a relationship across here for inversion. Because remember, the whole idea, remember what we're doing here is with this transformation, this inversion, I want the properties not to change, right? So the thing's going to be, all right, fine. I have the D's in x1, x2, x3. Let's say a full set of D's, for a particular crystal. But now I'm putting an inversion in that crystal axis. It means that when I go through inversion, the properties can't change, which means that the d's, we're looking for d's that are invariant. If any d's go from plus to minus, I have to put a 0 there, because that means the property would change under inversion, right? So what that means is that very quickly we see that the only value these can have is -1, and the only time that they're going to be there is when all three of them are there. So again, they're always negative with inversion, and I have to have them all there. If any one of them is not with this base, then they go to 0, right? So what this tells you is that all of the Dijk related here would have to flip into negative form, which means that, of course, well, that can't happen. Remember, the properties can't change. I'm doing this inversion, and I expect the properties not to change, which means that these become 0, right? So basically, any of the ones that actually would get across would be negative to begin with. So out of all of the transformation, right, the only ones that are going to make it are going to be the ones with -1, -1, -1. And any of those, they're all going to be negative, which they have to be 0. So basically, it means that any crystal with inversion means no piezoelectricity. So that is very cool because it shows you the power of symmetry arguments. Is that right here, right now, we could show you that a third rank tensor, and here we're talking about piezoelectricity, but if you have another third rank tensor, inversion will always do this, right? So basically, and it's because it's 3 minus 1s, right? So inversion, anytime you have a third rank tensor, is going to not be able to have that property. So it's pretty interesting and fundamental conclusion, right? Now remember what we did previously. We had taken so that's one thing. Right away we can tell that inversion is gonna we can have complete zeros through the entire D for anything with inversion. And so that is shown here. So any centrosymmetric crystal, they're automatically going to be all 0. And so that means things with an inversion center. And here's all the point groups that we had. Anything that contains those guys will be 0. What survives is certainly triclinic. Again, triclinic without, any kind of other symmetry in it, which I guess is kind of, the only one you could have, I guess, would be 1 bar. And so it is filled, unfortunately, if you have a piezoelectric crystal that is triclinic, then you will have a lot of 18 to deal with. And here we're using the reduced notation, right? This is with the 3, 4, 5, 6. Monoclinic, again, we can't have 2 over m, but we can put in a twofold axis like we did before. And remember that process, right? Remember how we put in a twofold axis and then we do the transformation, right, around here, right? So this becomes negative, this becomes negative. And then we say, what parts have changed. You can see here we get 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and zeros here. And we're left with here, this would be equivalent to the let's see, 4 is equivalent to 2, 3. and this is 3, 2, and 1, 6 would be 1, 2, and those have zeros in them. So this means that the twofold axis is probably along the y direction in order to put the zeros here. That's what I'm guessing, and the ones here, but I could be wrong. But remember how, like in our two-dimensional our tensor there, we had the rotation in whether you line it to the oh, it says right here actually parallel to the x3 axis, just like I was saying. So if you were to put it parallel to the x2 axis, these zeros would just move around. And you can see here, you still have to consider 8. So as we go to higher end symmetry, it's beautiful. You start to get rid of more. Now what's interesting here, monoclinic, we didn't do this example before, but you remember you can have a mirror plane that does not have an inversion axis. And so if it's perpendicular to x3, that means that, remember, if I have the x3 coming out of the plane here, and this is x1, and this is, x2, so a right-handed system, then M is this plane here, right? This is the plane of the paper, is M. And you can see here that it can still work, but I drop out, zeros over here. Continuing on, we have the higher coordinate systems here. Orthorhombic case, where we put the twofold axes parallel each one to x1, x2, x3. Now you're talking, because you can see that to make under those transformations, all of them, right? And remember we did an example before, we put one twofold axis, we put the second twofold axis, and it kills a lot of the zeros. So now you only have 3 these to worry about. And in 2mm, in the orthorhombic, I'm putting the twofold axis along the z-axis, the x3. And there, in that case, you can see here that the 3 twofold axes is actually more restrictive, that you have more elements to worry about in the 2mm case. And so on. As you go to cubic, there is actually no way. This is kind of interesting. Again, just like the case where we have inversion, in the cubic case of 432, there's so many axes in here that when you try to make the properties invariant under the 4-fold, the 3-fold, the 2-fold, it turns out that you can't do it. And so a 432 group cubic symmetry cannot have piezoelectricity. And for the other cubic groups 2, 3, and 4 bar 3m, you actually can, but it's a very restricted. There's only 3 to worry about. And so on. You can see here the tetragonal case. Each one of these, remember how you would do it, right? You put in the symmetry group and you do that transformation of axes, right, between the coordinate system. If it's twofold axis, you're rotating, 180 degrees. And then you just write out the coefficients and you see which ones drop, because it can't be plus and minus, it can't be flipping sign, or it can't be changing value or anything like that. The properties have to stay exactly the same. So you have to build the tensor so that it is the same under the addition of those symmetry elements. And so you keep on, doing it here. And then finally, I'm showing you it for the hexagonal groups with all the different variants you see here. And actually what's interesting is you can see that if I have a single 3-fold axis parallel to x3, I actually have quite a few elements to worry about in the matrix. So the 3-fold axis in a hexagonal group is not really, there's not a large effect from symmetry on there. And so it's kind of unique in the sense that if I have a hexagonal crystal with a 3-fold axis, it can be piezoelectric. There are a lot of um, elements that can lead to piezoelectricity. And of course, I guess the most symmetric one, if I'm looking at this, is probably these two right here, where there's only one element to worry about, and they have, of course, the highest symmetry. You can imagine if I have a 6-fold axis, two-fold axis, it's actually amazing that you can still have some non-zero elements in here. So that is how we now use the trick of the symmetry elements available inside these different crystals to knock out many of the elements in the tensor to make your life easier.